What's going on YouTube? Welcome to the very first episode of Bloodstains and to our complete series autopsy of the Halloween saga, where I'll be taking a look at the films that chronicle the wholesome life and times of everybody's favourite kitchen knife enthusiast, Michael Myers. The Halloween saga began with a movie that's still considered to be one of the most important horror movies of all time, and in the decades that have followed there have been 10 more entries into the series, some of which were pretty damn good, while some were just okay, and some were downright terrible, while one or two others were just plain bizarre.
Your shit ain't working up there or something?
This video is part 1 of a 2-part series, and in part 2 I'll be counting down what I think are the top 10 kills of the Halloween saga, so if you like this one, it'd be awesome if you check out that one too. Anyway, let's get on with it, and to kick things off, let's go back 40 plus years to the late 1970s when this all started. Halloween's creation began with a pretty simple idea for a low-budget horror movie which initially wasn't known as Halloween at all, but rather, the Babysitter Murders. Those among you who are very clever may have inferred from that title that the movie was meant to involve a group of babysitters, some of whom end up being murdered. The idea for the Babysitter Murders had been swirling around the mind of an independent producer and distributor named Irwin Yablans, who was looking for his next major project. Not too long prior to this, a low-budget independent action movie that Yablans had distributed had done really well in Europe and the UK. That movie was called Assault on Precinct 13, and if you've never seen it, then sort your fucking life out and give it a look, because it's a really great example of low-budget filmmaking. Assault on Precinct 13 was made on a budget of about $100,000, and the reason the budget was kept so low is because it had a very simple storyline and the action was confined to just a handful of locations. Yablans figured he could apply the same approach to the production of the Babysitter Murders, and so it made sense to pitch the project to the guy who had written and directed Precinct 13, a promising young filmmaker named John Carpenter. Carpenter was immediately attracted to the project, so he agreed to write and direct the movie on 3 conditions. 1, he'd have complete creative control over the project. 2, he'd get a share of the profits. And 3, he'd get to put his name above the title. Yablans was cool with those terms, as was film financier Mustafa Ricard, who saw the potential in the project and agreed to front a relatively modest $300,000 for its production budget. Not too long after this, the final jigsaw piece fell into place when Yablans had possibly the most important idea of his whole career, which was to have the Babysitter Murders take place on the night of a well-known holiday. But seeing as Black Christmas had already been done a few years earlier, at this point the movie became simply Halloween. The script was written in about 2 or 3 weeks, with the writing responsibilities divided between Carpenter and his co-writer Deborah Hill. Carpenter did what he does best, and focused on writing all the dark, disturbing, murdery shit, while Deborah Hill focused more on the dialogue of the teenage characters, which I've always thought gave everything a really nice feeling of authenticity. Speaking of Deborah Hill, she was born in the town of Haddonfield, New Jersey, which ended up becoming the namesake of Haddonfield, Illinois, the fictional town where Halloween takes place. In real life, Haddonfield, Illinois is just Pasadena, California, where it was shot over 4 weeks in May of 1978 before being released on October 25th that same year. In its first weekend, Halloween opened in only 4 Kansas City movie theaters, but audiences loved it so much that the positive word of mouth soon helped it secure a wide release across the US, and when it was eventually released internationally, the movie ultimately earned around $70 million in ticket sales off a $300,000 budget, which for a while made it the most commercially successful independent movie of all time. Whenever something's hugely successful like that, there's inevitably a ton of imitators that try to follow in its footsteps, and Halloween had no shortage of those. Despite the fact that it wasn't the first movie of its kind, it's still credited as the movie that made the slasher genre so popular in the late 70s and the 1980s. I've always found that a bit weird because, say what you will about the sequels, but the original Halloween's way more of an understated, slow-burning thriller than a full-blown slasher movie. We only get to see a handful of on-screen kills, none of which are particularly gory, as well as the death of a mechanic who's killed off-screen, and most tragically the death of one very good boy who was just trying to protect his house. Rest in peace, Lester. While most slasher movies rely on gore and jump scares, the original Halloween relies more on tension and slow-burning suspense. Part of that suspense comes from the outstanding work by cinematographer Dean Cundey, who gave the film a very dark and moody aesthetic, and was always able to make us feel like the boogeyman was lurking nearby. Even in the shots where you can't see him, the dimly lit cinematography makes you feel as though he might be hiding in the shadows and could jump out and say g'day without any warning whatsoever. And while the cinematography plays a huge part in creating Halloween's creepy atmosphere, it's absolutely impossible to overstate just how important the music was. Honestly, the score John Carpenter composed for Halloween serves as a perfect case study to just how important music can be for a film. And I really would love to include more of it in this video, but I don't particularly want to push my luck with YouTube's copyright detection system. But even with great music and great cinematography and just a great overall atmosphere, no horror movie can be truly great without an amazing villain. And when Halloween came out in 1978, the landscape of horror movies changed forever when the world was first introduced to Michael Myers.
I met him 15 years ago. I was told there was nothing left.
You could make a pretty strong argument that Michael Myers is the first real slasher movie villain, and he's also the favourite of many horror movie fans, myself included. I was about 13 when I started getting into horror movies, and once I started I would watch as many as I could get my hands on, which gave me my first introduction to the likes of Freddy and Jason and Leatherface and Ghostface and Pinhead, and that polite young man Norman Bates who runs a nice motel with his mum. Anyway, I've always loved the simplicity of Michael's design and the simplicity of his character overall. The sequels made varying attempts at mashing together a bizarre, convoluted, and oftentimes really fucking dumb backstory for him, but the idea of him being this kind of force of nature killing completely at random is part of what makes him so creepy in the original. He's by far the most important and beloved character of the Halloween saga, but alongside him are two other characters who are equally important. The first being Dr. Samuel Loomis, played by the late great Donald Pleasence. Pleasence was only on set for 5 days, but that was long enough to leave his mark on a movie that people would love for decades to come. His performance in the original was convincingly understated and painted Loomis as a man who was understandably exhausted and quietly terrified after 15 years spent trying to reach a child with no visible signs of humanity.
Seems to me you're just plain scared.
Yes. Yeah, I am.
Unfortunately, as the series wore on, the character of Loomis went from being a softly spoken voice of reason to a batshit crazy lunatic who probably lived in a stolen van. But regardless of what he was given to work with in the script, Donald Pleasence would always turn in a pretty great performance. There's a character archetype in horror movies known as the final girl. Typically, the final girl is smart and resourceful, but also vulnerable, sometimes bookish or shy, and generally more innocent than those around her. And I'm sure most horror movie fans would agree that the quintessential example of the final girl archetype is Laurie Strode, played by Jamie Lee Curtis. Right throughout the original film, Laurie's portrayed as having all of those characteristics I just mentioned, and she generally comes across as a lot more timid than her friends Annie and Linda. I think part of why her air of nervousness and vulnerability is so convincing is down to the fact that this was Jamie Lee Curtis's very first role in a feature film, compared to Donald Pleasence, for whom Halloween was his 108th on-screen appearance. But despite this being her first role in a feature film, she still absolutely crushed it. And not only did she go on to have a massively successful career, but her performance helped cement Laurie Strode as one of the most iconic characters in horror movie history. Laurie, Loomis, and Michael are the three most important characters in the Halloween saga, and the story of Michael stalking Laurie and her friends while Loomis desperately tries to prevent a bloodbath is a really simple one. And I think Halloween's always been a great example of the value of simplicity in filmmaking. Simplicity in storytelling can often be mistaken for laziness, but I think more than anything it's a sign that you have confidence in the quality of the story you're telling. Halloween's quite similar to franchises like Alien and Terminator and Die Hard and The Exorcist and even Rocky, in the sense that the first film of the series has a very simple storyline that's executed almost perfectly, while a lot of the sequels became increasingly convoluted and pretty disappointing. Halloween's simplicity is just one of the many things that made it so great, and it's a milestone in the history of horror movies and independent filmmaking in general. It came along at just the right time when audiences hadn't really seen anything like it, and it's one of those rare movies where everything fell into place perfectly. It really was lightning in a bottle, which is almost impossible to capture more than once, but holy fucking shit, that did not stop them from trying, did it? It was 3 years between Halloween 1 and 2, and during those 3 years, Owen Yablans produced a handful of other movies that included Hell Night, Nocturna, and 1979's Roller Boogie. This may come as a tremendous shock, but none of those movies came close to achieving the same monumental level of success as Halloween, and so in 1981, Halloween 2 was released in an attempt to make some more of that sweet, sweet Michael Myers cash. As many of you probably know, the movie's a direct sequel to Halloween 1, meaning it picks up right at the very end of the first film, at the moment when Loomis gate crashes Michael's homecoming party and blasts him off the first floor balcony. Psychiatric treatment was a bit less nuanced in the 1970s. By all accounts, none of the creative forces behind the original film were particularly keen on coming back for round 2. John Carpenter chose not to direct this one, but he did agree to write it, a process which he says mainly dealt with a lot of beer, sitting in front of a typewriter saying, "What the fuck am I doing? I don't know." The story's pretty straightforward, with Michael ending up at the hospital that Laurie was taken to after the events of the first film, and here he performs a bunch of amateur surgery on the hospital staff. This was also the movie where they made up the whole brother-sister connection between Michael and Laurie, which Carpenter says, quote, "exists purely as a function of having decided to become involved in the sequel to the movie where I didn't think there was much story left to tell." Cinematographer Dean Cundy was back behind the lens for Halloween 2 and did a pretty great job of matching the aesthetic of the original film. You can tell that a lot of work went into trying to make this movie match the original as closely as possible in pretty much every way, but they didn't quite pull it off. It didn't have the same feeling of suspense and was way more of a slasher movie that relied on violence and jump scares. I mean, the first kill of the movie is literally a jump scare. The body count in Halloween 2 is more than double that of the original, which isn't strictly a bad thing because slasher movies are lots of fun, and while Part 2 definitely isn't in the same league as its predecessor, it's still pretty good and usually ends up ranked somewhere in the top 5 movies of the Halloween series. The movie ends with Loomis securing the title of Psychiatrist of the Year when he deliberately causes an explosion that presumably blows him to pieces and burns Michael alive. Carpenter had intended for this to be an absolutely definitive conclusion to the story of Michael Myers, and for it to be the final time he would appear in a movie, which when you say it out loud is pretty fucking funny. About a year later, the series returned with Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, a movie that's 100% unrelated to every other movie in the franchise, purely because it's the only one that doesn't feature Michael Myers. The idea with Halloween 3 had been to turn the franchise into an anthology series, meaning that every movie going forward would have its own unique story, completely unrelated to any of the movies that came before it, with the only unifying factor among them being that they all took place on Halloween. Unfortunately, critics and audiences at the time weren't really on board with this idea, and the movie didn't do so well. Over the years though, it's developed a pretty substantial cult following, and I've got a lot of love for this movie just because of how bizarre and unique its whole premise is. That being said, I'm not really going to delve into it in this video because I think it deserves a video all of its own, which I have plans to do at a later date. But if you haven't seen it, I strongly recommend giving Halloween 3 a look because this movie is a completely unique chapter within the rest of the series. And before we go any further, I just want to stop for a second because from here on out, the continuity of the Halloween series becomes what could be very politely described as an absolute catastrophe fuck, and so I'll try to explain it now. Essentially, the Halloween series can be split into 4 separate timelines, and a new timeline began anytime the series completely shit the bed and left the story with nowhere to go. So in the first timeline, you've got Halloween 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6. By the end of Part 6, the series had gone so far off the fucking rails into this bizarre, creative no man's land that they said, "Ah, shit," and had to start over. And that brought us into our second timeline, beginning with Halloween H2O in 1998, which completely disregards the events of 4, 5 and 6 and instead acts as a direct continuation of Part 2. Halloween H2O was followed by Halloween Resurrection, which is a pretty ironic title given that the movie was so bad it ended up killing the franchise for 5 more years. After that, they rebooted the entire series in 2007, following it up with a sequel in 2009, both of which were directed by Rob Zombie. Mr. Zombie decided not to come back for Part 3, which sent Michael Myers back to the morgue for nearly a decade, until our 4th and hopefully final timeline commenced in Halloween 2018, which is a direct sequel to the original film and ignores everything else in the 40 years and 9 sequels that came before it. There's actually a line in Halloween 2018 where they dismiss the whole Michael-Laurie brother-sister connection.
Wasn't it her brother who, cold-blooded mutilated all those teenagers?
No. That's just a bit that some people made up to make them feel better, I think.
And I think that's a really nice moment that could extend to all of the other movies that came before it. Whenever something horrific happens in real life, it's totally normal for people to make up stories about the people involved. I like the idea that in Halloween 2018, all of the movies in the series that came before it are kind of like urban legend campfire stories that people have made up about Michael Myers over the years. Anyway, on that note, let's take a look at those stories, starting with the first timeline and Halloween's 4, 5 and 6, which are often referred to as the Thorn Trilogy. As I said just now, Michael was brought back for Halloween 4 after the disappointing response to Part 3, and for a guy who sustained the sort of injuries that no amount of aloe vera lotion could fix, he looks pretty good. Halloween 4 retreads a lot of the same ground as the original, with Michael escaping a hospital, returning to Haddonfield, and Loomis trying to stop him. For whatever reason, they decided to pursue the whole Michael must kill all his living relatives storyline, so this time his target is his niece Jamie Lloyd, played by Danielle Harris. Jamie's the daughter of Laurie Strode, who, in this timeline, was killed in a car wreck sometime after the events of Halloween 2.
Jamie's an orphan.
Fucking hell. Harris was only 11 years old when they shot this movie, and considering her age, she turned in a pretty damn good performance. In fact, as far as 80s slasher movies go, there's quite a lot to like in this movie. Aside from the fact that I don't like the look of the mask in this one, Halloween 4 is one of the better sequels in the series, with some really great kills and an ending that was absolutely perfect. Bringing the series full circle with a recreation of the opening scene from the original film and setting Jamie up as the new killer, or at least a new killer. Honestly, say what you want about the Halloween sequels, but this is one of the best endings to a horror movie I've ever seen, and it laid the groundwork that allowed the series to go in a bold new direction from that point forward, and the movie that came next made the absolute most of all that creative potential. I'm kidding, Halloween 5 is fucking dog shit. The production quality feels like something from a straight-to-VHS release. Some of the acting is legitimately worse than what you'd see in porn.
Mikey and I like it in the car.
Loomis has gone from a quietly dignified voice of reason to a deranged old fucking lunatic who spends most of the movie screaming at children. They completely squandered the ending of part 4, and instead of having Jamie become the new killer, they had her become a mute instead. And just for the fuck of it, they also decided to include a pair of bumbling comic relief cops, because yeah man, that's exactly what the series was crying out for. We also discover early on that for some reason Michael now has the sort of shit wrist tattoo you'd get on a bachelor party trip to Vietnam, and the tattoo may or may not have something to do with this random dude who shows up halfway through the movie dressed in all black with embarrassing cowboy boots. I get the impression this guy was meant to be mysterious and intimidating, but that air of menace is somewhat undermined by the fact that he rolls into town on a fucking bus. It also doesn't help that the man in black does absolutely fuck all until the end of the movie, at which point he busts Michael out of jail, which itself is a hilarious image, and then kills every cop in the building. I think they thought this would make for an amazing cliffhanger ending and a great setup for the next sequel, but it's safe to say that audiences just didn't give a shit. By this point it was 1989 and the slasher genre had been drained completely dry in terms of movie quality and profitability. This caused the producers to go back to the drawing board one more time, and when the series returned to screens in 1995, things got fucking weird. Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers, aka Halloween 6, The Curse of Studio Interference, is a beautiful disaster of a movie, and the thing it's probably most famous for is the fact that there are actually two very different versions of this film, the theatrical cut and the producer's cut. After initial test screenings of Halloween 6 didn't go over so well with audiences, the movie went back into production and they shot a ton of new footage. The resulting movie was the theatrical cut, which got dumped in theatres in 1995 and came and went virtually unnoticed. The other version of this movie, known as the producer's cut, became this kind of fabled collector's item among horror movie aficionados, because the only way you could get it for a long time was through shitty VHS and DVD bootlegs at horror conventions. Back in 2013, it had its very first official public screening at the movie theatre owned by Quentin Tarantino, before finally getting an official Blu-ray release in 2014. Make no mistake though, whether you're watching the theatrical cut or the producer's cut, both versions of this movie are fucking strange. At this point they'd completely leaned into the idea that Michael has some sort of supernatural origin, and they decided that his immortality stems from some ancient Celtic blood curse or something. I don't know. All you need to know is that this movie involves a weird murder cult and Paul Rudd trying to protect a baby that he finds in a cupboard. That baby belongs to Jamie Lloyd, who you may remember is Michael Myers' niece, and whose fate is different depending on which version of the movie you're watching. But what's important to note here is that the bub is yet another blood relative of Michael, meaning he has to try and kill it. And while that itself is pretty strange, there's one final plot point that is the icing on the borderline inedible cake that is Halloween 6. As I said, there are two versions of this film, the theatrical cut and the producer's cut. The producer's cut was never released in theatres because audiences didn't respond very well to it. And one of the things they didn't respond well to is the fact that in the producer's cut, it is implied very, 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 very heavily that Michael Myers, who is Jamie Lloyd's uncle, is also the father of the baby he spends the whole movie trying to kill. Just... what the fuck, man? I don't know who conceived that storyline, but it honestly sounds like something dreamed up in a really horrifying Michael Myers fanfiction thread. It's genuinely astounding that a movie series that began with the simple idea of a psychotic maniac killing a bunch of people at random somehow ended up being about a mid-90s incest murder cult. To its credit though, this movie actually has some pretty gnarly kills, especially in the theatrical cut, which had a much heavier emphasis on gore. And speaking of gore, I will say that as far as slasher films go, both versions of this movie are actually pretty enjoyable, especially if you're a fan of movies that get weird, because, make no mistake, the plot of Halloween 6 and the Thorn Trilogy as a whole is nothing short of bizarre. Not only in terms of its content, but also in terms of how it seems like they just had no idea where they were going with the story. I definitely can't think of any other movie reboot trilogy that started with an almost identical remake of the original film, followed it up with a movie that's regarded by many to be the worst of the series, before ending it with a movie that left audiences saying what the fuck was even happening in this movie. Quite understandably, they had no idea what to do with the story after this beautiful disaster. So after a few years of having Michael stand in the corner to think about what he did, they gave the series a fresh start in 1998 and kicked off the second timeline in the series with Halloween H2O. This time around, they made the excellent choice of bringing back Jamie Lee Curtis and catching up with Laurie Strode 20 years down the line from the events of Halloween's 1 and 2. She's given herself a new identity, now going by the name Kerry Tate, and living a new life as the headmistress of an elite private school somewhere in California, which was a very smart move on her part, because if there's one environment where you're guaranteed not to encounter any psychopaths whatsoever, it's definitely at an elite private school. This movie was a pretty great return to form, and among fans of the franchise, it's generally considered to be one of the better sequels. The story largely focuses on Laurie trying to cope with the trauma she's understandably not been able to rid herself of for 20 years. And you might disagree with me on this, but I've always seen Halloween H2O as more of a drama movie than an outright horror film. As far as horror movies go, the body count in this one is very low, and much like the 1978 original, the carnage doesn't really ramp up until the third act. To me, the movie's tone feels more aligned to that of the original film, relying less on the slasher movie tropes of parts 4, 5 and 6, and more on a sense of slow-burning tension that comes from the inevitable reunion of Laurie and Michael. This movie knew exactly what it was, and clocking in at a very lean 86 minutes, it doesn't overstay its welcome. This time around they kept things simple, and the movie is better because of it. Overall, Halloween H2O is a great sequel to the original two films and a respectable thriller in its own right. It's a movie that won back some of the franchise's original respectability, and it also had a pretty definitive ending that would have made this movie a great final chapter in the series. But then we had to bear witness to this fucking disaster. The early 2000s were an awkward and regrettable time, not just for me as a teenager, but for movies and pop culture in general. While Halloween Resurrection fails pretty spectacularly as a horror movie, it does succeed in being a catalogue of things that were popular at the turn of the century, like clamshell iBooks, Palm Pilots, reality TV, shit tons of hair gel, and that one guy from American Pie. As for the story, there's pretty much nothing to speak of. When the movie came out, people were wondering just how the fuck Michael could still be alive after Laurie went full-blown Henry VIII on him at the end of H2O. In the opening scene, we get a half-assed explanation that backpedals on that ending and shows that Laurie has ended up in a mental hospital as a result. Soon enough, Michael tracks Laurie down at said hospital and ends up killing her, which I think was meant to go down as some sort of landmark moment in horror movie history, but as with literally everything else in Halloween Resurrection, it just pissed a lot of people off.
I'll see you in hell.
From there, the opening scene has no connection whatsoever to the rest of the movie, which is always a very good indicator of a well-written screenplay. We're introduced to a cast of early 2000s 20-something stereotypes who all agree to spend the night in Killer Mike's childhood home as part of a reality TV show produced by Busta Rhymes.
Let the dangertainment begin now!
Take a moment to appreciate how many people had to agree that this was a good idea in order for this movie to be made. It honestly feels like they just found the screenplay for what should have been yet another forgettable pile of shit slasher movie from the early 2000s. Then they opened the script, they opened the find and replace option, selected all instances of the killer, replaced that with Michael Myers, hit print, and then started filming like an hour later. I will say though, the one and only thing that makes this movie just the tiniest bit more bearable to watch than Halloween 5 is that it's so ridiculous it ends up being mindlessly entertaining. Halloween 5 on the other hand was just a tedious, poorly made shit show from start to finish. And I know it's borderline treason to suggest that Halloween Resurrection isn't the absolute worst that this series has to offer, but I really just do not have any patience for part 5. I'm sorry. Anyway, Michael does his thing. He kills nearly all of these excruciatingly boring characters, gets in a kung fu fight with Busta Rhymes, because fuck it, why not? And the movie ends with him being sent to the morgue, which at that point was a perfect metaphor for the franchise itself. It's a real shame because H2O was a genuinely good return to form for the series, but then Resurrection came along and shit the bed with so much force that it took 5 years for audiences to forget about the stench. By 2007, the franchise was nearly 30 years old, and speaking from experience, it's not uncommon at that age to reevaluate your life a little bit and start making changes in the hope that it'll make people like you again. With Rob Zombie's Halloween and its 2009 sequel, that's exactly what we got. A re-evaluation slash reinvention slash reimagining of the Halloween mythology, which sought to change things up pretty drastically in an attempt to try and win back the love of audiences. These two movies are entirely their own thing, which makes them the third timeline in the series, and in my opinion they're also the two most divisive movies in the series. As far as I'm concerned, the amount of enjoyment you get from them depends entirely on how you feel about Rob Zombie as a filmmaker. Both movies are absolutely slathered in the grimy, sleazy, hellbilly aesthetic that's become a hallmark of every other movie in Rob Zombie's filmography, and there's a real visceral brutality to the violence as well, which some people have said is over the top and excessive, but I've always thought was pretty well done. To me, there's always been something really unsettling about seeing just how traumatic violence inflicted on the human body can be. As for the movies themselves, Halloween 2007 spends its first hour reimagining the origin story of Michael Myers, taking the approach that he came from a very broken home and attempting to use real-world psychology as a way of explaining his evil nature. The second half of the movie is basically a scene-for-scene remake of Halloween 1978, and I always found it a bit odd that Zombie took so many creative liberties with the Halloween mythology in the first half of the film, only to stick so rigidly to the original film's plot in the second half. That being said, it was still an interesting take on the Halloween mythology, and it made $80 million off a $15 million budget, which Zombie evidently used to leverage more creative control in the sequel, because Halloween 2 2009 is a completely unique beast. Of all the movies in the Halloween series, I'd say this one is easily the most divisive among fans, with some saying it's one of the worst, if not the worst entry in the entire series, while others argue that it's actually pretty decent. Personally, I fall into the latter category because, although it's not a great movie, I still give Rob Zombie credit for making some pretty bold creative choices and actually trying to do something interesting with it. After a prologue sequence that serves as a pretty great homage to the original Halloween 2, the story picks up 2 years down the line, only to find that the three most well-established characters of the series have all been changed pretty dramatically. I totally understand why some fans weren't into the character changes, with Laurie being reinvented as a traumatized bad girl, Loomis being reinvented as a raging egomaniac dickhead, and Michael being reinvented as a giant hobo Sasquatch, but again, I give Rob Zombie some credit for actually trying something new. And speaking of trying new things, this movie has a pretty surreal, hallucinatory nightmare quality to a lot of it, which we hadn't really seen in the series before this, and I think Halloween 2's visual style is one of its most interesting components. Unfortunately though, the plot is a total mess, and the movie clocks in at over 2 hours long, which is way too long for something like this, and it feels pretty bloated as a result. Like I said earlier, I think how you feel about these movies depends entirely on how you feel about Rob Zombie as a filmmaker. And while I think these are pretty good horror movies on their own terms, I don't think they're particularly good Halloween movies, mostly because I firmly believe that Michael Myers has never and will never need any sort of deep backstory. At the same time though, I generally like Rob Zombie's movies and their overall aesthetic, but I just don't think that aesthetic was a great fit for the Halloween series. That being said, get him in the director's chair for a new Texas Chainsaw Massacre and I'll be there at the cinema on day one. And that brings us to the fourth and hopefully final timeline of the Halloween saga, a timeline that currently consists of Halloween 1978 and its direct sequel Halloween 2018, which ignores every other film in the series. As we've seen through this video, the quality of the Halloween sequels has been a bit of a mixed bag, but 40 years after the franchise began, we finally got a sequel that just about stands shoulder to shoulder with the original film. The The story picks up decades after Michael Myers' first rampage, and it seems like everyone in the world has moved on except for Laurie Strode. Much like Halloween H2O, the film spends a lot of time exploring the lingering trauma she experienced after the events of the first film, only this time around things go deeper as the story explores the generational impact that emotional trauma can have on families. Laurie's lifetime of suffering has been intense, but that suffering has bled across 3 generations of Strode women. Her relationship with her family in this movie is an absolute shit show, and it's pretty clear that her entire adult life has been one of isolation and paranoia, living in fear that one day Michael Myers will return to Haddonfield. And can you bloody believe it? Michael Myers returns to Haddonfield. After escaping custody, Michael heads straight for the only place he's ever called home, and wastes no time in establishing himself as Haddonfield's most bloodthirsty senior citizen, apparently completely unburdened by the ailments common among men his age like bad knees or a swollen prostate. I've criticised some of the sequels for relying way too heavily on slasher movie tropes instead of focusing more on suspense and character development, and I feel like Halloween 2018 manages to walk a very fine line between both. Some of the kills in this movie are among the best and most intense in the entire series, and while we do spend a lot of time with Michael in this movie, I think what makes it really good is the time we spend with Laurie and her family. From start to finish, it's hugely apparent that David Gordon Green and Danny McBride have a huge amount of love for the Halloween saga, and along the way we get quite a few little nods to the original film. And while I'm on the subject of things that Halloween 2018 did well, I can't not talk about just how fucking good Michael's mask looked in this one. Across the 11 films Michael's appeared in, there have always been slight variations in how the mask looks, with some looking way better than others, but I can honestly say that the mask in 2018 is the absolute best it's looked since the original film. The mask is just one of many things that made Halloween 2018 an absolutely meticulously crafted piece of fan service, but it also brought a lot more to the table than just a shitload of nostalgia. The ending was satisfying enough that this movie probably didn't need a sequel, but as it stands, there are currently 2 of them on the horizon, which I guess we'll see whenever this whole COVID disaster starts to ease up a little bit. On more than one occasion in the past, we've seen the Halloween series revived with a pretty great film, only to be followed up with an absolute cinematic war crime, but with Halloween 2018 made to such a high standard, there's pretty good reason to be optimistic for the next 2 films.
Happy Halloween, Michael.
Anyway, that brings us to the end of our complete autopsy of the Halloween series. If you've liked this video, just a reminder, there is a part 2 where I count down what I think are the top 10 best kills of the series, so it'd be awesome if you could check that out as well. If you've made it all the way through this video, then thank you so much for your time, and I'm grateful to have had your attention for so long. Anyway, thanks again for watching Bloodstains, and until next time, take it easy. Cheers.